Good morning, one and all. I call to order the special meeting of the General Assembly dedicated to the life and memory of His Excellency Nelson Mandela. I would like to warmly welcome all of you to this meeting. This special meeting provides an opportunity for the membership to pay tribute to President Mandela and his achievements as an icon of the anti-apartheid movement and a global statement. Permit me then to make a statement. Excellencies, Secretary General, distinguished guests, former Mayor of New York City, David Dinkins, ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here today to pay tribute to and acknowledge the legacy of a most unusual man, Nelson Mandela, a man who moved a nation, a continent, and the world around him through his actions, his words, and his thoughts. A man who lived 27 years a captive, but never let his jail cell limit his fierce intellect, his passion for justice, rob him of his humanity, his dignity, or his humor. Such a man will not be forgotten, not by us today to honor his life, and not by our children and our children's children. Nelson Mandela, and in our histories, as a pathbreaker, a history maker, and an outspoken advocate for all that is better in each of us. This past week, the collective thoughts of the international community have been with the Mandela family, the people and government of South Africa, who are mourning the loss of Nelson Mandela, affectionately known as Madiba, and celebrating his glorious life. The tributes have been numerous and generous for this beloved leader, whose life's work and example touched and inspired people in every part of the world. Today, in this, our Assembly of Nations, we gather to add our voices to that chorus of tributes and to reaffirm global admiration for the exceptional qualities that Madiba exhibited during his lifetime, which are invaluable to the life and dignity of all peoples and transcend the boundaries of race and ethnicity, language, culture, and geography. We all admire the person who's able to forgive the seemingly unforgivable, whose courage overwhelms challenging and desolate circumstances, who finds hope amongst bleak and improbable odds, and who demonstrates humility even when being honored and exalted. More than that, who by sheer force of will and perseverance, who by pursuing the broader and inclusive positive over the limiting and restricting, became an instrument of change and peace, elevated the human condition, and altered our collective human experience even more. Today, we will hear many tributes to a leader who used his life, including his time in prison, to hone the qualities he will ultimately need to navigate his country from a discriminatory and shameful past to a new future based on equality and justice for all. Let us take a moment in this, our shared Assembly of Nations, to reflect on what I believe to be one of his most historic speeches of our time, made on his inauguration as President of South Africa. And I quote, "We understand it's still that there is no easy road to freedom. We know it well that none of us acting alone can achieve success. We must therefore act together as a united people for national reconciliation, for nation building, for the birth of a new world. Let there be justice for all. Let there be peace for all. Let there be work, bread, water, and salt for all. End quote. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as we honor him today, let us not forget that in the winter of 1964, in the desolation of Robben Island, Madiba was confined to a cell where he would spend 18 years with a bucket for a toilet and forced to do hard labor in a quarry. He was allowed just one visitor a year for 30 minutes and could write and receive just one letter every 6 months. And yet, that prisoner in that jail cell on that desolate island became a lasting symbol of his country's struggle against the cruel and unjust system of apartheid. That prisoner, when released by his captors, became a global leader and a beacon of hope in the larger struggle against injustice, intolerance, cruelty, and vengeance. This struggle goes on in both the most profound global challenges marginalized peoples and communities in the world today. So today, in this our United Nations, let us honor Nelson Mandela by letting his legacy live on in our continuing struggle against poverty, injustice, and the destruction of the human person and human spirit, and by setting an example for our children and our children's children. We too must work together to reduce hunger and injustice, to build lasting peace and sustainable development, to stop genocide and combat hatred. Let us remember that we can also be like him because we too can choose the better way. Choose to work toward those causes that are greater and better than our narrow interests, and in so doing, find and nurture the best in ourselves and others. I thank you. I now give the floor to our Secretary General, His Excellency Ban Ki-moon. Secretary General.
Your Excellency, Ambassador John Ash, President of the General Assembly, Your Excellency, Ambassador Mamabolo, Permanent Representative of South Africa to the United Nations, the Honorable David Dinkins, former Mayor of New York City, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I thank the President of the General Assembly for organizing this ceremony. I extend a warm welcome to today's special guests from many walks of life. Those guests include Mr. Enuga Reddy, a retired staff member who was among the many UN Secretariat officials who played invaluable roles in the struggle against apartheid. We join in this global assembly to honor our era's greatest ambassador for human dignity. Nelson Mandela was a human being with the flaws and frailties like any of us. And yet, from his humanity came humility. From humility came strength. From strength came transformation. From utter goodness came epic greatness. Isolated for years in a tiny cell, he emerged with a vision as big as all creation. Unable to see his own children grow up, he became a father to his country and an inspiration to us all. Last week, I had the unforgettable privilege, together with the President of General Assembly, to take part in the service in his memory in Johannesburg. There were kings and queens, presidents and prime ministers and foreign ministers, many thousands, tens of thousands of people united in tribute. The skies over Soweto opened up, as if in blessing. The rain came down all day long. It was a reminder that there can be no rainbow without rain. So together, in Nelson Mandela's Rainbow Nation, we mourned the tragic loss and celebrated a triumphant life. I saw once again how much Nelson Mandela meant to the people of South Africa. And the people of South Africa shared with me how much the United Nations meant to them. Their struggle was our struggle. From its earliest days, the General Assembly took on the poison of racial discrimination in South Africa. Through the years, the Assembly used every tool we had, including sanctions, embargoes, and diplomatic isolation, to bring about change. A special committee against apartheid, supported by the UN Center Against Apartheid and the Trust Fund, provided crucial support. We refused to relent. In his first address to a United Nations audience upon his release, Nelson Mandela said, I quote, "Despite the thickness of the prison walls, all of us in Robben Island could hear your voices," end of quote. Nelson Mandela came back to the United Nations again and again as president, as global peacemaker, as transcendent moral voice. Each year, we mark the International Day Against Racial Discrimination on the anniversary of the Sharpeville massacre. And of course, we celebrate Nelson Mandela International Day on his birthday, July 18th, as a way to build on his contributions and foster a culture of peace and public service. Through his extraordinary life, Nelson Mandela showed that tyranny and oppression never have the last word. Justice triumphs in the end. I can understand when some say we will never see his like again, but I see it differently. Because whenever people stand up for human rights, wherever people speak out for freedom and reach out for reconciliation, that is Nelson Mandela. That is the heritage of hope he bestowed on each and every one of us. That is our inheritance. Now it is our duty to build a better world that he showed is within our grasp. Let us follow his rainbow. Today and every day, let us be inspired by his passion, his compassion, and his undying conviction in the human spirit and the global good. Thank you.
I thank our Secretary General for his statement, and I now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of South Africa, Ambassador Kingsley Mamabolo. Excellency.
Your Excellency, President of the General Assembly, Mr. John Ash, Excellency Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, former Mayor, David Jenkins, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of President Jacob Gedleyihlekisa Zuma of the Republic of South Africa, the Nelson Mandela family, the government and people of South Africa, I would like to thank you for convening this special meeting of the General Assembly dedicated to the life and memory of the late Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela. I would also like to thank the Secretary General the distinguished guests of honor sitting at the podium and elsewhere in the room, and the distinguished delegates for gracing this occasion. We thank Africa and the world for their solidarity and support since Madiba's passing, and all those who managed to travel all the way to South Africa to mourn our loss. During this period, it became loud and clear to us that Madiba's passing is a loss to all of us throughout the world. We have been comforted by your calls and messages of condolences. We were also touched by many of you who came to sign the condolence book at the South African Mission and here at the United Nations. Mr. President, leaders are not just born to the role. They are born, then made, and sometimes unmade by their own actions. A leader who is not in tune with the followership soon becomes a leader in limbo, and sooner rather than later, with us. Nelson Mandela never fell into limbo as a leader. At least South Africans could draw comfort from the way Mandela's death brought them together. It is another of his legacies that for the first time in their history, people of all races, faith, ages, and income brackets came together to grieve as one in South Africa. Writing a preface to Shakespeare's Macbeth, one of the scholars said, and I quote, "Every now and again in the history of the world, a man is born, a philosopher, a scientist, a poet, a ruler. It does not matter where he is born and lives. He belongs to all of us. It does not matter when he is born. He belongs to all time," unquote. Such a man was Nelson Mandela. Mr. President, ours began largely as a romantic kind of public mourning. The kind of mourning simply eulogizes the dead and extols their greatness. The orator never critiques how the dead lived or how they even died. The eulogy, in other words, does not pose questions, but simply restates the simple facts of how the dead lived and died. Former President Thabo Mbeki proved to be an exception to this. Speaking at the Oxford Synagogue in Killarney, Johannesburg, Mbeki adopted the twin Greek conventions of Epaenes and Paraenesis, quote, praise for the fallen and advice for the living, unquote. Mbeki agreed that we should indeed celebrate Mandela's life, quote, but we should not end there. We must also ask ourselves a question, what about the future, unquote. In raising questions, Mbeki engaged in what is called tragic public mourning. The orator in this kind of mourning not only praises, but also questions. It doesn't seek to strike consensus nor maintain the status quo. Rather, a tragic public mourning invites mourners into self-introspection, to probe what brought the calamity or how to take the lessons from the dead to avoid making similar choices in future and take society forward. Mr. President, it was also our renowned international guest, United States President Barack Obama, who challenged romantic roaming that eulogizes without any introspection or self-criticism. He said, and I quote, "For the people of South Africa, for those he inspired around the globe, Madiba's passing is rightly a time of mourning and a time to celebrate his heroic life. But I believe it should also prompt in each of us a time for self-reflection. With honesty, regardless of our station or circumstances, we must ask, how well have I applied his lesson in my own life? There are too many of us who happily embrace Madiba's legacy of racial reconciliation, but passionately resist even modest reforms that would challenge chronic poverty and growing inequality. There are too many leaders who claim solidarity with Madiba's struggle for freedom, but do not tolerate dissent from their own people. And there are too many of us who stand on the sidelines, comfortable in complacency or cynicism when our voices must be heard, unquote. Obama's speech and Mbekis at the synagogue both call for interpretive, critical mourning instead of offering eulogies that absolves us of responsibility and self-questioning. They demand that we ask ourselves whether we are worthy heirs to Mandela's inheritance. In conclusion, Mr. President, speaking on Sunday at the state funeral for Mandela at his ancestral home of Kunu, Eastern Cape, my own president, His Excellency President Zuma, said, and I quote, "We cherish the lessons you, Mandela, taught us of the importance of reconciliation, forgiveness, tolerance, and compassion. We have to continue building the type of society you worked tirelessly to construct. We have to take your legacy forward. As your journey ends today, ours must continue in earnest. One thing we can assure you of today, Dada, as you take your final step, is that South Africa will continue to rise. We pledge to take your vision forward." Unquote. I thank you all for your attention.
I thank Ambassador Mamabola for his statement. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to our special guest, Mr. David Dinkins, former mayor of New York City. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much. See, we old people need help. I appreciate that. I'm delighted to be here and very pleased to see the chamber so filled. I'm moved to say usual protocols observed. I learned that from South African diplomats over time, but I do feel the need to acknowledge formally His Excellency John Ash, President of the 68th session of the General Assembly, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and my friend, the ambassador, as I call him, the permanent representative of the Mission of South Africa, Kingsley Mamabolo. It's good to be with you again. As this audience knows, I was privileged to be mayor of New York City in 1990 when Madiba was released from prison and came first to New York. There were other places he might have come in the United States, but we worked hard to get him to come to New York, and he did. He stayed with my bride and me at Gracie Mansion, which is where the mayor lives in New York, unless you are named Bloomberg, and he, the most amazing thing about Madiba was he was always the same, a total absence of bitterness, whether playing with our grandchildren, and our granddaughter at that time was just 3 months old, or whether being challenged by the media. He was always the same. And I was privileged to be in South Africa the next year as his guest in 1991. I was there when they campaigned for the new government. I was there when the election was held, and I saw my friend Bishop Tutu vote. He cast his ballot and leaped in the air and said, "Wee!" And so it's been my good fortune to be in South Africa a lot. I have a brief statement I'd like to share with you. I was told I'd be given 3 minutes, and I think I've used 1.5 minutes of that already. Death is something inevitable. When a man has done what he considers to be his duty to his people and his country, he can rest in peace. I believe I have made that effort, and that is therefore why I will sleep for eternity. So said Madiba. So spoke my friend nearly 20 years before his own death, as a lesson to us all to live our lives making the effort and finding the peace he has embraced at last. The rest he has earned, the eternal gratitude of a people and their country, humankind, and our world. Perhaps once in a generation, a man, a movement, and a moment come together on a mission for freedom that is so powerful, so courageous, so just that all the guns and dogs, hatred and violence, deprivation and force that can be mustered cannot turn them back. It has been our good fortune that this moment came within our lifetimes, and a great blessing that it came in the person of Nelson Mandela. His release from prison meant much to us, and how sweet that victory when, after more than 27 years behind bars, he walked out of his cell. He entered that cell a prisoner, but exited those walls and stepped onto the world stage a free man, recognized and embraced in every nation as a leader in the global fight for freedom. New Yorkers were among the first to welcome him as our own personal champion, when people of all races and ethnic groups showered him with ticker tape in the Canyon of Heroes this city reserves for the very few. At this moment in history, and as long as there are people who hold dear the principles to which Nelson Mandela has dedicated his life, we can proudly say, we are the soldiers of Madiba. Nelson Mandela fought the good fight. He finished his course. He kept the faith, and now he can rest. He's left us with so much more than memories. He's left us a rich legacy of his strength, a legacy of his warmth and charm, a legacy of the great gifts of his courage and wisdom. It is said, my friends, that service to others is the rent we pay for our space on earth. Nelson Mandela departed us paid in full. Let him not look down and find any of us in arrears. Each year in July, because my birthday is also in July, I send him the same message. Happy birthday, Madiba. When you're 109, I'll be 100. And we'll meet and toast one another. I won't be able to send that message anymore.
I thank former Mayor Dinkins for his statement. I now invite participants to view a video message from Archbishop Desmond Tutu.
Your Excellency, the President of the General Assembly, Your Excellency, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and all of you, Your Excellencies, representatives of the different countries. What an immense privilege it is to have been asked to address this special session. Thank you. May I start by thanking you and this institution because it was because of your wonderful support of our anti-apartheid struggle when you imposed a ban on South African goods and suspended the membership of the Republic of South Africa, that you gave a huge impetus to that struggle. Imagine if Nelson Mandela had died in prison. So we thank you for having helped to release him. What can we say that has not already been said? Here is a man who went to prison angry at the awful, awful miscarriage of justice that had happened in the Rivonia trial. Angry that his right and that of his people to be just human beings, that right had been subverted. And can you imagine what would have happened to our country if the Nelson Mandela who walked out in 1990 had been consumed by anger and bitterness and a lust for revenge and retribution? Our country would have gone up in smoke. Incredibly, the man who stepped out of prison showed a remarkable degree of magnanimity, a desire for reconciliation and forgiveness. And that is what he has come to be known for. He helped our country make that transition from being the pariah of the world to being the flavor of the month. The repulsive caterpillar transformed into a gorgeous butterfly. We, in thanking you, want to pledge that our country will want to become a symbol for the whole world of reconciliation, of magnanimity, of an acceptance of one another, because we believe in Ubuntu. I am because you are. That we are made for interdependence. And we have laid to rest an extraordinary human being who became an icon for the whole world. We thank you for you who came to pay tribute to him. We realize that goodness is something that attracts human beings everywhere. Madiba was not the president of one of the most powerful, most flourishing countries. And yet, nearly everyone who was anyone flocked to South Africa to pay their respects. We thank you for all of that. We thank you for reminding us that we have an extraordinary example set us, which we will follow as we become more and more truly the rainbow people of God. God bless all of you.
I will now open the floor to member states. In this regard, you are encouraged to limit your intervention to 3 minutes so as to allow maximum participation by all present. First on my list is the distinguished permanent representative of Fiji, speaking on behalf of the Group of 77 and China. Excellency.
I speak here today on behalf of the 133 countries of the Group of 77 and China to join the international voice that rises in praise of the late President Mandela. At the outset, I express the group's solidarity with the government and people of South Africa, in particular with the family of the late President at this their time of bereavement. The grieving is in the first place theirs, and our respect and condolences are turned in their direction. But they should know the whole world mourns with them, and that we will forever carry forward within our lives the spirit of the late President. For his life of service and leadership has transcended to a place of universality in human history, reserved only for those leaders who have moved our communal attention away from the strife and divisiveness to which we are so prone, towards a higher moral ground where justice and benevolence rule. The world has embraced the story of Nelson Mandela's life, the human rights lawyer, the prisoner of conscience, the Nobel Prize-winning international peacemaker, and the first democratically elected president of a free South Africa. Indeed, his life is an essential page in the history of the 20th century, and many of Madiba's homilies have become part of our communal consciousness. During the last 2 weeks, you will have heard his most famous quotations repeated many times over, uttered in more eloquent vessels than this humble address. But I make no apology for repeating a few of them now, for they should be spoken again and again, and we must see to it that Madiba's story and his uplifting words are passed on to our children and to their children. Here at the United Nations, charged as we are with massive responsibilities on behalf of humankind, we are fortified by the enduring lessons the great man left us. Such fortification should then lead us to speaking and acting in the mode he extolled. He should move us to pursue the goals that Nelson Mandela struggled so long and hard to achieve, and whatever our handicaps, we should aspire to reach the higher ground to which he pointed us. In a world that still suffers the curses of racism and religious intolerance, let us heed once more Madiba's words, and I quote, "No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite." For those of us emerging from situations of conflict, injustice, and deprivation, there is this from an undaunted man walking free from 27 years of wrongful imprisonment, saying as he walked towards his freedom, "I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison." Leaders cannot afford to hate, Madiba told us, for hatred clouds the judgment. And he once put it this way, "Resentment is like drinking poison and then hoping it will kill your enemies." If you want to make peace with your enemy, he said, you have to work with your enemy. Then he becomes your partner. This great son of Africa, this man of the South, who in his time became a universal moral leader for all humanity, humbles us with his thoughts on leadership. A good leader can engage in debate frankly and thoroughly, he explained, knowing that at the end, he and the other side must be closer and thus emerge stronger. You don't have that idea when you're arrogant, superficial, and uninformed. End of quote. He counseled us that we must be ever honest with ourselves and that effective peacemakers are people of integrity and honesty, yes, but they are also people of humility. Next year, we, the member states of the United Nations, will begin the design of the post-2015 development agenda. We're all agreed that our work on this agenda's design and its application must have at its very center the efforts of the international community to eradicate poverty globally. And as we apply ourselves to this great undertaking, let us remember Madiba's exhortation on the subject, and I quote, "Overcoming poverty is not a task of charity. It is an act of justice. Like slavery and apartheid, poverty is not natural. It is man-made, and it can be overcome and eradicated by the actions of human beings." And in that same stirring speech in Trafalgar Square in 2005, he said, "Sometimes it falls on a generation to be great. You can be that generation. Let your greatness blossom." I'm sure many of you have been asked how we will complete the mammoth task of designing the Sustainable Development Goals and post-2015 development agenda within the mere 2 years allocated to us. Next time you're asked that question, just quote Madiba when he quipped, "It always seems impossible until it's done." In setting our goals, let us not shrink from high aspiration. Let us take the steps to that higher ground, however arduous and taxing that might be. Madiba motivated us to do so in his words, "There is no passion to be found in playing small, in settling for a life that is less than the one you are capable of living." Madiba's long walk has ended now, as it must for all of us one day, but we have lifted up the burden of his quest, and we will carry it forward and pass it in time to others. For as long as poverty exists in this world, and as long as good people are denied the essential services that are their fundamental human right, we will not have reached that higher ground. And so again, in the words of Madiba, we must use time wisely and forever realize that the time is always ripe to do right. And lest we forget, he also said, to deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity. On that subject, the great man also wrote, "The truth is that we are not yet free. We have merely achieved the freedom to be free, the right not to be oppressed. We have not taken the final step of our journey, but the first step on a longer and even more difficult road. For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. The true test of our devotion to freedom is just beginning." Acknowledging Madiba's contribution to the struggle for freedom and democracy internationally and the promotion of a culture of peace throughout the world every year on the 18th of July, we will be honoring him through the observation of Nelson Mandela International Day. The focus of this day will not be long speeches, but practical acts of public service, with each of us devoting 67 minutes of that day each year to public service. Let us mark our calendars now for next year and begin planning how best we might utilize the 67 minutes we personally will give to the uplifting of the public good in a manner that enhances the freedoms of others. I'd like to conclude this statement with a smile on my face, for that is what Madiba wanted of us. To bring up a smile to all our faces, I remind you of his words when he said, "I am fundamentally an optimist. Whether that comes from nature or nurture, I cannot say. Part of being optimistic is keeping one's head pointed towards the sun, one's feet moving forward. There were many dark moments when my faith in humanity was sorely tested, but I would not and could not give myself up to despair." So allow me to close with the last Madiba homily that should be ingrained in the mind of every diplomat as he or she leaves their capital, heading for meaningful multilateral service at the United Nations. "Appearances matter," Madiba said, "and remember to smile." I had the privilege of meeting Madiba in an informal setting some 20 years ago, and in my mind I have a snapshot that corresponds directly with the image of him to which the world now holds dear. A man with kindly eyes and an open heart, who emanated honesty and integrity, wisdom and good humor. A man who offered a hand of friendship and in whom you could implacably trust. A man who, to use his own words, had a truly formidable combination of a good head and a good heart. A man who, with all the troubles he shouldered, was always ready to bestow upon you, whatever your station in life, an objection overruling, heartwarming, humanity-sharing, wide-beaming smile. And so, dear colleagues, as we go about our days here at the United Nations, and wherever our lives may take us, when we think upon President Nelson Mandela in the time ahead of us, let us always remember to smile. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Fiji, speaking on behalf of Group 77. I now invite the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran, speaking on behalf of the non-aligned movement. Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. President. Following the passing of President Mandela, the Coordinating Bureau of the Non-Aligned Movement issued a statement that I have the honor to present in this special meeting of this August Assembly as follows. The Coordinating Bureau of the Non-Aligned Movement expresses its deep sorrow for the sad passing away of anti-apartheid hero Nelson Mandela on Thursday, December 5, 2013. It conveys its sincere condolences and deepest sympathy to his family and the people and the government of South Africa for the loss of this great leader. The Coordinating Bureau of the NAM pays tribute to the extensive personal achievements of President Nelson Mandela, a visionary and great leader of our time who dedicated his life to the service of humanity and symbolized the triumph of justice over oppression, of hope over despair, and of peace over conflict. While he was the champion of Africa's struggle for liberation and unity, he was also a figure of unique international standing who had a profound impact on the lives of people across the world. His fight projected itself far beyond his country and his continent and helps set the standard for a new culture of tolerance and peace, both at the national and international level. There was a special relationship between President Mandela and our movement in the past 50 years. The non-aligned movement actively supported his struggle against apartheid and colonialism since its inception. And following the collapse of the apartheid regime, President Mandela became one of the great leaders of our movement and has played an instrumental and active role over the years on issues of concern and vital importance to its members. Nelson Mandela will continue to be an integral part of the history of South Africa, an African continent, and his legacy will be a beacon of hope and a source of strength for many generations to come in the whole world. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran, speaking on behalf of the non-aligned movement. I now call upon the distinguished permanent representative of the Gambia, speaking on behalf of the African states. Excellency.
Your Excellency, Mr. Secretary General, Your Excellency, the President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the entire Africa Group, including my humble self, I feel singularly privileged and profoundly honored to pay tribute to one of the most illustrious sons of our time, the revered Nelson Mandela, whose loss the whole world will continue to brood over for as long as his name remains in the books of world history. December 5th marked a sad day for the people of South Africa, for Africa, and for the world at large, as news of the death of Madiba reverberated across the globe. Today, we stand together in one accord, transcending continents as a global community to honor the life and memory of the late President of South Africa, Nelson Mandela. Speaking on behalf of the African group, allow me to express sincere appreciation to you, Mr. President, for organizing this special meeting of the General Assembly. It is only fitting that this august body, whose pioneering and relentless efforts contributed to the dismantling of the heinous system of apartheid, initiates a special meeting dedicated to the life and memory of the iconic leader of the anti-apartheid struggle, who remains an inspiration to us all. Africa's leadership role at the helm of the UN Special Committee Against Apartheid sealed the African consensus in the international campaign against the then apartheid regime in South Africa. The African group, for its part, and as a tangible demonstration of moral obligation and duty to preserve the unique legacy of our Madiba, celebrated this illustrious son of Africa at a special meeting of the African group on Friday, 13 December 2013, culminating in a decision to name the conference hall at the Permanent Observer Mission of the African Union as Mandela Hall. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as we pay tribute to late President Mandela, no amount of time will be adequate for us to chronicle the tremendous lessons that can be drawn from his inspiring and rich life. In life, he represented a global symbol of justice, peace, reconciliation, integrity, and courage. We mourn Mandela's demise, but celebrate his inspiring journey in this life. To paraphrase a well-known line, as parting is the lot of humankind, come we have and depart we must. Therefore, we must learn to live well and depart well. Indeed, Madiba has departed well. In the wake of his departure, South Africa has lost a dear patriot, and Africans have lost a pride of the continent. Importantly, however, the world has lost a global citizen and an icon, and humanity has lost a genuinely human international statesman. When I addressed my colleagues of the African group a few days ago, during the group's special meeting honoring the life and legacy of President Mandela, I reminded that our Madiba had fought a good fight on the road to freedom. The freedom he so ardently yearned for his beloved people stood the test of times. Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we take consolation in the realization that Madiba's spirit and legacy lives on. His thoughts will remain to school us. His action should help us restrain ourselves in times of crisis. We mourn Madiba's demise but celebrate his life. After all, mas vale morir de pie que vivir de rodillas, said a great Latin American leader. It is better to die on one's feet than to live on one's knees. All Madiba was yearning for is to see all human beings live in a free and dignified manner. Mandela epitomizes the qualities of true liberator. For many, he was an objective strategist or tactician with a high degree of discipline, patience, tolerance, and tactfulness, which the youth and all leaders can learn from. Fascinatingly,